but I think it'll still be going up to YouTube where we store it anyways.
Okay, you are live. Hello.
All right.
Hi.
Thank you, Roger.
Hello, everybody. I think we're live now. Can everybody see me and hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, see you.
Great. Welcome to what is going to be Antirelativity. And so it's going to be Introduction to Antirelativity Part 1. And our group here, John Chappell, Natural Philosophy Society, we're based from the work of John Chappell, who highlighted that there are problems with Einstein's relativity. And he gave a talk back in 1990s, which we are going to now look at. And we would discuss this, and in future presentations we'll hopefully go on to other issues in what is criticizing Einstein's relativity. So can we go to that now, please, to John Chappell's talk?
All right, we are going to start the video here.
Yeah, go straight to the video, then I'll show me slides. Here we go. It's John Chappell.
And can everyone hear the audio?
I can hear it, yeah.
What I'm going to do is the second of a three-part Newtonian presentation at this conference. The first part this morning was a poster session that's just concluding, which has a couple of papers there, at least a full paper and an abstract from some Russian physicists who couldn't attend. There'll be a debate this afternoon involving Lee Coe and Louis Carroll Epstein. Besides us, there are some visiting Neo-Newtonians in the audience. Adolphe Martin there, who came all the way from Montreal, and Nolan Harder. Anybody else? Kingsley didn't arrive, did he? Now, it seems like this is a small group, a small presentation compared to what's going on in Russia and other parts of Europe. Adolphe, Lee, and myself, and the Russian physicists at the poster session all took part in last year's second biennial conference on problems of space and time in natural science, which had over 100 members and was dedicated primarily to showing flaws in the special theory of relativity. To reach larger audiences, we're doing some taping here today. We notified 44 physics departments and universities and colleges in this state. Evidently, all of them have boycotted the meeting, which is their usual result, their usual strategy. Now, there's just no way to be intellectually honest and at the same time spare the feelings of believers in modern physics. Doctrines are rife with problems, and the one most in need of being totally discarded is the one most widely believed to be the most solidly proven, namely the special theory of relativity. I'll try to soften my evaluation a bit by adding some humor now and then, but I'm afraid even this humor may be lost on dedicated proponents of special theory. Some may find it humorous that I should even try to make a case against special relativity in 20 minutes. But that's all the time I have, and I am supplementing my talk with these handouts, the yellow and green ones, which I urge you to pick up. And of course, there'll be time to cover a lot more ground in this afternoon's debate. Now, if something is seriously wrong with special relativity, a skeptic might wonder why the appropriate counter-arguments have not been widely published and discussed. Well, they haven't because the academic establishment has not allowed them to be. The thought control protecting the special theory from criticism has been thorough and harsh. Morally as well as intellectually speaking, this censorship may well be the most indefensible in all the history of science and philosophy. It isn't just that neo-Newtonian submissions to the standard physics and general science journals are routinely tossed aside without even being refereed, or that those to philosophy journals are frequently refereed, but by so-called experts who display an abysmal lack of knowledge of even today's orthodox scientific ideas, not to mention the English language. A more serious problem is the weeding out of critical minds at every stage in the education of a physicist. During my graduate study, I overheard an elementary physics class being chastised by its instructor for daring to offer non-relativistic explanations to certain experiments. Not long before that, a physicist in the same department had threatened to destroy my doctoral program if I dared to write a thesis critical of special relativity. even though the thesis would be in history of science, not his department. In the late 1940s, a certain undergraduate physics major at Harvard figured out how to explain the so-called proofs of general relativity in terms of Newtonian physics. His advisor did not refute his results, but simply advised him to find another major. Many more similar examples could be cited. Consequently, those who earn PhDs in physics and go on to teach in universities are selected in terms of their compliance to orthodox dogma more than in terms of the incisiveness and originality of their thinking. They are not at all necessarily the people best able to discern what physical nature is all about. As an example of thought suppression at scientific meetings, consider my own previous appearance at a AAAS podium, my only one, in Houston in 1979. The national meeting there, through a set of conjoining circumstances calculated to drop one's jaw in amazement, the official chairman, even though he knew what I was up to, allowed me to open the 6-hour Einstein centennial session with an unscheduled criticism of special relativity. You may smile at the utter incredulity of this episode, but the AAAS officials were not amused. They quickly withdrew from sale the audio tapes for the session and then extended their multi-year record of refusing to allow any scheduled session of neo-Newtonian papers at their national meetings. But change is now in the air. Neo-Newtonian research, meetings, and visited publications have been increasing exponentially for the past several years. The Leningrad meeting was only the most prominent event in all this. A movement that for decades has been forced underground is now about to work its way into prominence, with hundreds, if not thousands, of active researchers in its ranks. Hard to tell how many because of the silence of the censorship that keeps people unaware of everything that's happening. Anyway, it seems to me an especially hopeful sign that the same AAAS has now opened its doors to us here at the specific division meeting. Now, the type of flawed thinking responsible for special relativity can be divided into two categories, formal and transformal. The formal problems involve history, philosophy, and empirical evidence. These categories overlap and are most appropriately treated together. About a century ago, physics began to be dominated by Machian positivism. This approach was marked by deep suspicion of metaphysics and of speculation in general, and by a devotion to hard empirical evidence. Mach was so suspicious of what he could not sense directly that he doubted even the atomic theory of matter, not to mention Newtonian time and space. But rather paradoxically, by the late 20th century, the term positivism has come to mean in the social as well as the natural sciences an approach more involved with mathematics and theorizing than with a close focus on empirical evidence. And even more paradoxically, the kind of physics that has lately evolved out of positivism and operationalism is marked by wild flights of fanciful speculation, often totally devoid of any empirical basis. Physicists now talk seriously of multidimensional spaces, but one-dimensional superstrings. And I feel like I ought to be George Carlin up here. One-dimensional superstrings, you know. At least until recently, they were enthralled with particles of superluminal velocity deduced by means of assuming that time can flow backwards. But these ideas aren't really much more fantastic than others for which they do claim solid empirical support, such as curved space, time dilation, and space contraction. An ordinary educated person looking in on this from outside may easily be tempted to accuse physicists of dealing more in science fiction than in real science. And perhaps not so coincidentally, a few years ago I noticed that the MIT bookstore contains, apart from the science textbooks, about 12 times as many books on science fiction as on science. But any non-physicist who expresses such doubts out loud is likely to be accused of being mired in outdated common sense, as if he or she were just as naive as some pre-Columbian believer in a flat earth. But genuine common sense, which I take to involve an honest mixture of logic, respect for the evidence of the senses, and perhaps also intuition, defined as a logical guess about the unknown based upon the known, is much more valid and useful than today's typical physicist who is so anxious to claim insights not available to ordinary people wants to admit. Genuine common sense, along with its scholarly extensions in terms of formal logic, theory of perception, and the like, has indeed been left on the sidelines during the transition from early 20th century positivism, which I think was a healthy attitude in its own time, to the current era of wildly non-empirical speculation, and physics is much the poorer for it. In terms of the original rise of Machian positivism, the trouble is that an obsessive concentration on sense evidence is not enough by itself to provide the kind of results that physicists want. They will reach for generalization and theories anyway. And if their worldview tells them that metaphysics, logic, and philosophy in general are not important, then they're likely to do their reaching in a careless and invalid manner. What it all boils down to is that you cannot do science without also doing philosophy. Science cannot even begin without affirming, at least implicitly, the basic premise of philosophical realism, that there is a world outside of ourselves that we can study objectively. And it cannot proceed without due respect for the principles of logic, or else it may produce meaningless and contradictory results. Late 20th century physics concentrates on data and calculation, but these do not by themselves constitute empirical fact and reason, a proper balance between which is necessary for any productive science. For data must be properly interpreted before it becomes empirical fact. And calculation is not science unless the symbols involved are related in a meaningful way to the real world. Actually, you can know about scientific matters without doing any science. By careful use of logical reason, attention to its experience and to semantics, you can know, for example, that time cannot slow down. It just can't. But I won't try to prove that right now. I'm going to dwell on more purely scientific matters. Please notice, anyway, that I am not promoting philosophy because I think it should replace scientific procedures. Instead, it should accompany them so as to assure that they yield meaningful results. Now, I should also point out that just because I recommend more philosophy does not mean I subscribe to what most leading philosophers have been doing in recent decades. They have been, in large part, abdicating their roles as philosophers. You can read philosopher Houston Smith, who has serious reservations about the recent course of his field, recounting claims of the death of metaphysics by Heidegger, the end of epistemology by Rorty, and even of the irrelevance of logic by Willard Quine and of language by Donald Davidson, which together have led to serious doubt that there is any further role for philosophy as a discipline. Even short of the nonsense of deconstructionism, epistemological relativism has been so extreme as to produce serious doubt that there is even such a thing as objective truth. Now, all of this derives, I believe, from the same broad Western worldview of the past century or more that has afflicted physics. It involves a hyper-skepticism, an excessive subjectivism, an ample enthusiasm for taking the easy way out, for avoiding tough problems rather than trying to grapple with them and improve our knowledge. To use a religious analogy, the preference has been for embracing agnosticism rather than trying to find a better definition of God. So the need in philosophy as well as in physics is to look back to earlier times for guidance, pay more attention, for example, to Aristotelian logic and to Cartesian rationalism instead of spurning them as too ancient or too flawed by misguided and imperfect application. Now, the surest way to replace science fiction with real science in physics is to reemphasize the role of reason, specifically of logic, in the interpretation of data. Physicists have far too often announced what their data means without reasoning properly from the raw data to its alleged meaning. In the case of special relativity, this carelessness began at the very start of Einstein's famous 1905 paper, in the thought experiment in which he claimed to prove that simultaneity is relative to motion. As you can see on my yellow handout on page 2 of it, philosopher Melbourne Evans used to be at the University of New Mexico, and as far as I know, was the only regular faculty member of the United States 20, 30, 40 years ago who regularly taught his students that special relativity was wrong, proved 30 years ago that this claim is based entirely on faulty logic. Einstein ascribed two different and contradictory velocities to the same light beam. His result depended entirely on this violation of the law of non-contradiction. There is so much faulty logic in this 1905 paper by Einstein that I view it not as a classic, but as an anti-classic, in the sense that every time you examine it, you are likely to find some hitherto undetected flaw. The faulty logic has continued through paper after paper announcing so-called experimental proof for special relativity. The first published claim for proof of time dilation, or relativity of time, was by Kennedy and Thorndike in 1932. Within a few years, Herbert Ives, one of the most prestigious and incisive critics of special theory until he died, I believe, in the late 1950s, proved the utterly fallacious basis of the whole concept of this experiment. The first enduring claim for time dilation comes from a class of experiments involving measurement of the momentum or energy of atmospheric mesons. The first of these was performed by Rossi and Hall at MIT. They were based there anyway, published in 1941. Now, in 1967, I was in the East, and I wrote to Rossi and asked if I could discuss this experiment with him while visiting the Cambridge area during August. He replied that he would be gone all month. When I arrived at his office on August 16th and found him there, he stammered around and claimed he was just stopping off between trips, and he refused to deal with it. Perhaps he had already noticed what I had noticed about his experiment, that it proved absolutely nothing, except that mass increase and time dilation are mutually dependent features of the theoretical structure of special relativity. For in processing their measurements of meson momentum, Rossi and Hall introduced the relativistic formula for mass increase, which contains the famous gamma factor. This is the basic math of their experiment. I'm not going to go through every step, but they did find by experiment that the range of the meson equals velocity times time, very basic. They were measuring, their raw data consist of momentum from a scintillation counter. And so they were measuring not time, but momentum. That was their raw data. And basically what's happening here is they're introducing the relativistic mass increase formula that says that an object becomes more massive as it moves faster into their calculations in such a way that time dilation comes out at the other end. This gamma factor, the square root of 1 minus b squared over c squared, enters the calculations by way of mass increase, comes out at the other end after you grind out the calculations as time dilation. If you assume that mass does not increase, you cannot get time dilation. So the experiment proves nothing except the mutual interdependence of these two features of special relativity. The same result, by the same method, came from the more famous Frisch and Smith experiment on mesons in 1963, and from all the experiments done at the CERN laboratories in Switzerland, such as the famous, well often cited paper by J. Bailey et al., 1977 in Nature. They all start with mass, counted on a scintillation counter. They introduce the gamma factor like a deus ex machina. Without it, there would be no time dilation. Now, this might be okay if there was such a thing as mass increase, but if you look at the experiments claiming to prove mass increase, done by Kaufmann and Bucherer, reported in the German literature between 1899 and 1909, you find that they did not unequivocally prove mass increase. What they measured was variable force on a moving charge. It was an arbitrary decision to assign all the change to mass. This actually started to happen before special relativity, but somehow they just blended together and these results became part of the special theory. So we see there is an interlocking structure in claims for proof of special relativity, consisting very largely of circular reasoning and arbitrary assumptions. There are other time dilation experiments. The Ives-Stilwell transverse Doppler effect in 1938 proves nothing at all about time, but only about how ions emit photons. The Heffley-Keating experiment with clocks flying around the Earth in opposite directions has been judged by Louis Essen in a letter to Lee Coe as faulty because the results are smaller than the range of the experimental error. And also, of course, you have this going around the Earth as you're doing some of the time dilation experiments. There's circular motion. There's a lot of acceleration going on, which is supposed to be outside the range, the realm of special relativity. There are many other experiments, part of the total story. All are unequivocal at best, and usually totally misconstrued or poorly conducted or both. Wallace Cantor of San Diego published a book in 1976 going through 65 of these experiments and finding crucial flaws in every one. Establishment physicists don't do this kind of critique. They don't examine experiments critically. They don't go inside the experimental report to follow step by step from the data to the announced result. If the result suits them, they just accept it uncritically. What is worse, their knowledge of the history of experimental work is often so bad that they misrepresent even the announced results, bringing them closer to their own preconceived ideas. You know, Stephen Horvath, a UCSB physiologist, in whom a number of sessions are being held in his honor, just this morning told of great problems coming from ignoring early work, early research decades ago, including twice how he repeated work done earlier that he didn't know existed or had been reported in the literature. So knowledge of earlier experimental results is a problem through all the sciences. For example, in 1980, Scientific American, a physicist said, the Michelson-Morley 1887 ether drift experiment proves the light postulate of relativity. that is, the constancy of the velocity of light with respect to the observer. Of course, it did not do that, as the earlier literature, both primary and secondary, makes very clear. Rather, the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment is perfectly consistent with the lorentzian additive theory, in which c plus or minus v with respect to the observer holds. Exactly the opposite of what the Scientific American writer claimed. Yet Scientific American would not let me correct the matter in a letter. Now, we don't have time to go into alternative theories. There's quite a few of them. They're usually either ether theories or additive velocity theories. I myself believe we can have both features in the same theory, but I'm not going to go into how I would do that right now. There are a plethora of alternatives to special relativity, but this in itself does not render special relativity valid any more than the multitude of JFK assassination conspiracy theories makes the Warren Report valid. At least all theoreticians do realize something is seriously wrong with special relativity. Most reject it completely. This really isn't all that difficult for those who are not intimidated by prestige and power. Building an alternative theory, however, is tough. But the toughest problem of all, I think, is to try to explain how so profound an error has persisted for so long, and still it goes on. A psychological and sociological problem is what we're really looking at here. We're talking about Kuhn's idea of the irrational basis for paradigm choice, which he may have sensed was a valid concept, perhaps subconsciously, because he was so thoroughly trained in physics himself. At any rate, what are the reasons behind this irrational basis of this paradigm choice? It's hard to know for sure. I think a desire for privileged knowledge, as I indicated before, is part of it. Physicists want to believe they know something that ordinary people can't know easily. The desire for bizarre and strange concepts is another part of it. The hyper-development of the concept of change that has gradually taken over the intellectual world in the West began with Darwin, and it's gone way too far now, so that we lose all faith in stable concepts and everything seems elusive. That's probably part of it too. That's speculative. I'm not going to go any further with it right now. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I went a little bit long. Now, we are taping this, and I want to ask if anybody in the audience is sensitive to being taped. So we will shut off the tape recorders before the question session. Would anybody want us to shut them off?
No. This is national policy. We follow it here.
Okay, that's the end of that then. So put me back here. Hi. Hello. Finish recording? Yep, I'm back. Hi. So hopefully you can hear me. And so this is what our group is founded upon. This talk that was given back in the 1990s, where he says he went to a physics conference and he got boycotted by the physicists. The physicists didn't really want to, most of the physicists didn't turn up. There was only a very few physicists who turned up for this conference of people who were complaining about Einstein's relativity. And normally physics conferences don't allow people to come on and criticize Einstein's relativity, but there was a special compensation at that time to let these people who were not agreeing with Einstein's relativity to come on and voice their criticisms. And of course, most of the physics community didn't want to hear it, and so they didn't go to these talks. And so it's what we got is a boycott, and the physicists, mainstream physicists, have closed minds, and they don't want to hear criticism of Einstein's relativity. But the main he was bringing out the main points even back then. The criticism with Einstein's relativity, pointing out that it was just, if I made my notes, wild speculation, all these things about multi-dimensions and all that. It's all sort of like gets added into it, and it's kind of was based on this very strange philosophy at the time called positivism, and that philosophy doesn't really make any sense, but it came out of that. And also he's pointing out that the relativists, they seem to use very faulty logic, and when it comes to the experiments which are supposed to show that Einstein's relativity is correct, well, they seem to be applying faulty logic to that and making strange interpretations of the experiment, which the experiments don't really show. And so really, as he's pointed out, there's no critical thinking involved by the physicists. They're not looking at the experiments and saying, do these experiments really show what we're claiming them to show? They're just glossing over that. And so physicists don't seem to reason properly with their experiments. I'm going by my notes by what he said. And so he brings up the example of the time dilation experiment with mesons. And it's all very strange about how they managed to interpret these mesons as showing time dilation. So he criticizes that, and then he gets onto the Michelson-Morley experiment, and that many people say the Michelson-Morley experiment shows light speed constancy, but as he points out, that is a false claim, because actually the experiment can be interpreted from the Wick's theory, which is a theory of ballistic light, and where the speed is not constant. And so when he tried to point this out to Scientific American, that the claim they were making was false, the Scientific American refused to correct that. And so this is basically what we are facing with those who believe in Einstein's relativity. They're just blocking their minds to the people that criticize it, and they're blocking it in every way they can. They're not open to listening to people who are complaining that what they're believing is false. And for my kind of perspective on this thing, from the background of my education, it seems to be that many physicists believe in Einstein's relativity, but in the case of engineers, when they go through their education system, and then when they encounter the physicists teaching them about relativity, many of them are then rejecting that relativity and thinking it's nonsense. And then as people that are working and having to earn a living, they're not able then to do anything about it. They're not able usually to bring forth their criticism until they retire from work. And after retiring from work, some of them devote their efforts to pointing out that Einstein's relativity is wrong. But by that time, the physicists will just look at these people who are in their 60s and just dismiss them as senile. If you're criticizing Einstein's relativity and you're over 60, then you're senile. You just got dementia or something like that. So the physics community have managed to form what is called a knowledge filter, where they hold strongly onto their beliefs, and they're not willing to listen to criticism of what they believe. And that is that situation in the 1990s when first John Chappell brought this issue up at that physics conference. And since then, nothing has really changed. The physics community, as far as I can see, have still decided to block any criticism of Einstein's relativity. And by that I mean block any sensible criticism of Einstein's relativity, because they do try to modify Einstein's relativity when they encounter a problem such as what they call dark matter and dark energy. They then sort of like try to add something extra to Einstein's relativity. But if you're trying to attack Einstein's relativity at its central core beliefs, the physics community is strong in defending that belief, and they won't budge from that. And so hopefully I'll be doing other sessions, and I will be pointing out what other people have said about this. If I'm able to get some videos from these other people, I'm hoping to show this ongoing criticism with Einstein's relativity and show how it's being blocked by the mainstream. So I want to open it up now to discussion as to what do people think of John Chappell's talk, which he gave, and which is the foundations of this group, the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. Hello. Hello, Franklin. Thank you. Are you there? Do I have to do anything?
So I'm here, and I was kind of shocked about the muon experiment. I always imagined they actually measured the length of time that they were able to travel.
Well, it's probably other experiments since then. But
have they reconfirmed some of those experiments? Because that's obviously faulty to bake in the relativity formula to get out the time dilation, right? That's obviously cool. But do you know whether they have done any more legitimate, like, if you're going to measure the time of life, you should measure the time of flight of an actual muon, or like, he mentioned CERN and stuff like that. And there, I was pretty certain that they could actually measure, time of flight. It's like when you're trying to measure something like change in time, you should be measuring time as opposed to momentum or mass or anything else like that, right?
Yeah.
Do you know whether they've updated any of those experiments?
Unfortunately, this topic is so vast, it's very difficult to follow it all, and don't really know what CERN is saying about this. But back in the time when it was the experiment which they were doing back in the 1990s, the experiment was if my hand, it was mesons coming down from outer space, and they were counting the number of mesons that they had in the upper atmosphere, and the number which they had which hit the detector, and the assumptions they were making was that they should be amount of decay of these mesons. They should have a half-life, and there should be fewer neutrinos at the detector than what was up in the atmosphere. But then they decide that it must be time dilation going on, which stops the mesons decaying at such a great rate. And so that's the way their thinking was. And
but I was just wondering, have they reconfirmed it with better experiments?
I wouldn't think they have confirmed any better experiments. What they have is mathematics, and they're interpreting the mathematics in that way. So that they're already starting from an assumption of the postulates of relativity, and based on that, they've got their mathematics, and then from the mathematics, they're interpreting the experiments. So if it doesn't fit, if they do an experiment and the mathematics doesn't quite fit, then they're going to assume an extra effect. It's not a case of they're going to question the assumptions upon which they base their mathematics. So I don't think they've done anything better, but I don't really know what CERN would say about it, what experiment they would be saying about it. I've looked at other things. One of the points he brought up was mass increase, and back in the day when I was taught relativity, they did have relativistic mass, but now when I'm checking with what's being taught, because I went to Oxford University, see what they're teaching, and they don't believe in relativistic mass anymore. So what they do is they change relativity from what we taught decades ago, and they've changed it to something else. But it's sort of like you kind of like, well, you've changed the theory, contraction. They've changed the theory by doing that, and they refuse to accept that. It's kind of like double talk. It's sort of like you change the theory, but they refuse to accept they changed the theory. And so,
although I think that there have been some better.
Yeah.
I do believe that there are relativistic, effects on clock. I prefer to call it clock dilation rather than time dilation, right? If you say time dilation, I don't know, that would kind of, you'd have to be able to say that it dilates in only certain places, I suppose.
John Chappell was complaining about calling it time because you got clocks, and the clocks are showing different time intervals, and the sort of like hidden assumption the relativists, the believers in relativity do, is to assume that it's time. It's rather than question the clocks being not operating properly, they assume that's time. What the clocks record, they assume that is time. So then they assume it's an effect on time. And if you think about that logically, that doesn't really make sense. But clocks being different, they're going to assume that's an effect on time. So I think it's more accurate to say it's an effect on the clocks, but they're saying it's an effect on time. And of course, when you're saying it's an effect on time, you then entering science fiction, where you can have things like time travel and so forth. So you're straight into a fantastic science fiction.
Yeah, it's science fiction, but
and it's very entertaining. It's very appealing to think that time changes.
If every physical process slowed down to the same extent, then in some ways, then you could say that was kind of a time effect, versus it like we're put something in a refrigerator, and you could see that things in the refrigerator would apparently slow down in time because the vegetable you stick or whatever in the refrigerator lasts 3 weeks versus a day on the counter, right? So in that way, that clearly is not a time effect. But I was thinking if you could find some effect that equally affected any physical process you could look at, then that would be kind of different and might be considered a kind of time dilation. It would be a local time dial. But I'm just saying that philosophically, if I could find a box, and that anything you stuck in that box you could find would have its time processes slowed by exactly the same amount, then maybe you could say it was time dilation inside of that box. But
if you take a clock and put it in a freezer and it stops, it's frozen, they don't suddenly say that's an effect on time for some unknown reason. But when you've got meat and things and people, and if you freeze them, and it's what you're doing to affecting the biological process. And for some reason they don't. I think that is sort of biological processes are like a clock as well. So for some reason they kind of schizo with their clocks.
Yes, I also have something to say about, I do believe we have much better evidence for these time effects from, say, GPS. We've been having, tons of discussions about GPS, and I don't think anyone denies that the Lorentz factor and gravitational factors are having a practical influence on these clocks. So I would disagree to any contention that there's, for example, no effect, right? Maybe our nomenclature is bad on the how it thinks.
It was our GPS engineer who was the expert on this, Ron Hatch, has unfortunately now passed away, but he was pointing out that he didn't think the GPS was working from Einstein's relativity. You can't, what you've got is clocks and GPS, and you want to adjust them to make them work properly in agreement. And so he didn't think it was working from Einstein's relativity. It's sort of like, if you go via the mainstream, they're just going to insist that it proves Einstein's relativity. So once again, you've got a disconnect in their thinking process. What they've got, as John Chappell's pointing out, is faulty thinking. And so you can do these experiments, and the goes through the mainstream's thinking process, which is faulty logic, and they're going to make extraordinary claims as to what those experiments mean. And it doesn't really, there's a disconnect between how they're interpreting it and what the experiments really show.
Yeah, I was surprised, in the discussion that came out that that Einstein's theory, it seems mathematically indistinguishable from Lorentzian theory. I mean, the 1 over c squared minus v squared, we call that the Lorentz transform, right?
Yeah.
The Einstein transform, and it existed before Einstein. So and the Lorentz transform is based on the idea that there is a physical fixed ether frame, right? Back then, people thought that there was a physical luminiferous ether that controls the travel of light. So strangely, I come to the conclusion that Einstein's theory is really that, since it's mathematically identical to Lorentzian theory, that it's Lorentz theory, which is a physical ether theory.
Yeah,
but he claims it's not, that you don't have to use a physical theory. You don't need a physical theory, and then somehow divorces common sense notions of light travels at a constant speed, in the same sense that sound travels at a constant, because it depends upon fixed ether frame, to this really wacky concept of, well, it travels the same speed no matter who's looking at it and who's measuring it with whatever things they want to measure it with. And that's the thing which seems to be utter nonsense.
As well as the problem with disputing the way that the experiments are interpreted, even if you sort of like agree with the mathematics, you can start disputing the way that the mathematics is being interpreted. So it's basically two different.
They're proving the Lorentzian transform.
Yeah.
And that works perfectly well. You can make calculations and blah blah blah. The experiments match up with it.
So if you believe in the mathematics, then you've got a problem of, are you going to interpret it from what Einstein says in 1905, or you can interpret it from what Lorentz says. So you've got the interpretation problem with the mathematics. So this is where all the faulty logic comes into it. The mainstream.
We have some questions coming in, so if people want to ask some questions, just go ahead and put them out there. Asking, how would you distribute the Lorentz transformation, though? Well, we had Stephen Gift here the other week, and I just asked him this question of, well, if Lorentzian transforms are so close to, well, actually, he advocates for Stellari transformations. So, and he has this big list of things where Lorentzian transforms failed, and he called, the Lorentzian transform and special relativity be the same. He bunches in the same thing. But he has a Stellari transforms, and like a bunch of tests fail. Lorentzian transformation experiments fail, versus his Stellari transformations, which pass. Although the most basic feature of the Stellari transforms is this presumption of a fixed special frame. So I don't know what the difference between Stellari and Lorentzian transformation is. But as he has done, you could point out to certain experiments, and certain of these experiments I don't understand what they mean, like right hand lever, I have no idea what that means, but apparently still already passes.
Yeah, with Stefan Gift, he accepts that Lorentz transformations do work on some experiments, but he's pointing out that the Sorelli transformations work on more experiments than what the Lorentz transformations work upon, and he thinks that is disproving Einstein's relativity. But the way Einstein's relativity seems to work, to me, is it's not a definitive theory. So you've got the experiments where the Lorentz transformations work, and then if you want to go to other experiments where the Lorentz transformations don't work, then the way that they seem to deal with Einstein's relativity is they then add a bit more on to Einstein's relativity, and they still say that's Einstein's relativity. So I don't really agree with Stefan's way of looking at it, that him saying that these Sorelli transformations agree with more experiments than Lorentz transformations is able to disprove relativity, because relativity is not just the Lorentz transformations, it's extra things added on top of it. But he won't accept that sort of thing. He thinks he's onto something, that if he shows that the Lorentz transformations don't work for all experiments, which he thinks they should work for, then he thinks he's disproved the theory. But that is not the way I think the mainstream is thinking about it. They're prepared to add more and more onto Einstein's relativity, and they're starting from a basis of these experiments agree with Lorentz transformations. If you go to other experiments which don't, then we're just going to add more onto it and still call it Einstein's relativity. But that's not the way that I think Stefan is thinking about it.
Well, I think Stefan is trying to think of it that in order to overthrow a theory, you have to present a better version to that. So I guess that's his strategy. Although I'm kind of still kind of confused about, what's the difference between the Lorentzian transforms and special relativity. For example, special relativity, the relativists clearly admit that you'll get the twin paradox, right? Twin A will be older than twin B. And they try to explain that away by saying weird things like, well, you can't really do that experiment because there's acceleration, because the other twin's got to stop and come back. And special relativity doesn't apply to those situations. But otherwise, logically, it's like, that's what it would predict, right? And it clearly doesn't happen and can't happen.
Yeah.
Versus a Lorentz who would just say, oh, no, you just measure the two according to the one fixed frame, and you can exactly figure out how old the other ones would be. And one would be older than the other.
Yeah. So I think it's ambiguity in Einstein's relativity, because all the extra things you can add on to it or take away from it.
Yes, well, I mean, if you remove the fixed frame, it's like let's do Lorentzian transforms, except let's remove the fixed frame, which is the very basis of the entire transform.
Yeah. When you go to Einstein's paper in 1905, he has a clock on the equatorial and a clock at somewhere else, and the clocks are definitely showing different times. It's not a symmetrical setup. And so he is treating it like there is a preferred frame in his paper, even though he's saying it's the relativity principle. So what he's saying seems to be in conflict with what he then goes on to do. So it's he seems to contradict himself. But when you point out that he seems to be contradicting himself, of course, then the mainstream who are believers in Einstein's relativity just block their minds to that again. They disagree. But sort of like with the relativity principle, you shouldn't have a preferred frame, because that's basically what the idea is. But then you could then going ahead and using a preferred frame. Well, he's not stuck to what he said he's going to do.
No, that's the first thing Einstein said in the 1905 paper. It says, let us unambiguously establish this frame, which we will call the stationary frame. That is like 53 times in his paper.
Yeah.
And what is that? That is got to be a fixed
preferred frame.
frame, which is
It preferred frame, but it's not calling it a preferred frame. But you'd interpret that as a preferred frame. But then his supporters would say, no, don't interpret it as a preferred frame.
See, and that doesn't make any sense. It's a preferred frame. It's
faulty logic. It's faulty logic again from the believers. They're not willing to accept that there's problems in understanding with what Einstein's saying. He seems to contradict himself. It's not acceptable to them to do that, to believe that, though.
Yeah, we have some other comments here. We'll just see what we say here. So, my view is that relativity is incomprehensible. There doesn't seem to be a way to conceptually grasp the ideas, such as time dilation. You could accept it since there is alleged proof.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, I think because it's the physicists and engineers in general are different. Engineers, you've got to make things work. You're more practical on getting things to work, and physicists seem to be doing something else. And so when engineers that they talk Newtonian mechanics, electrical engineering or mechanical engineering and so forth, and when they get older and they sort of like introduced to relativity by the physicists, then they sort of like start complaining that it doesn't make sense, a large number of them. So it's a conflict between an engineer's way of thinking and a physicist's way of thinking.
Now, a lot of what was in the video was mostly philosophy. I was actually expecting a little bit more hard-hitting anti-relativity stuff, but it was mostly an attack on the scientific method here. So, but so there's a question here: is there any type of epistemology that is accepted by mainstream theoretical physics, or is it seen as too philosophical to worry about?
Well, I think John Chappell did briefly touch on it. He did say about can't do physics without philosophy, and he complained that what's going on in modern philosophy is not good, and I think that's pretty much the problem. That if you've had good philosophers, then they would look at Einstein's relativity and say Einstein's relativity doesn't make sense. But unfortunately, I think Einstein's relativity from the physics has influenced the philosophers. And so philosophy has been corrupted by Einstein's relativity. So it's not just a corruption of physics, it's a corruption of philosophy as well, because the philosophers are just going to assume the physicists are right. It's just a knock-on process. And so when these more modern philosophers start philosophizing, a lot of the time they're going to say things which don't make sense. Whereas previously, before Einstein's relativity, they were more grounded in a more sensible type of philosophy background.
Well, we've got Nick here, so I'm going to add Nick here. And Nick, so you can go ahead, unmute yourself. And what comments do you have about this? Because you were surprised, I think you haven't seen this particular video by our founder, John Chappell himself.
I thought that was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Regarding time dilation, I have my thinking is a lot like Franklin's, and I haven't seen what Franklin has thought on his path, so we came to this pretty much independently. I gave a presentation on the concept of time having its own dimension. In fact, time having a counterpart in physical reality is incorrect, and that's one of the bases for special relativity. So, and in that presentation, I sort of jokingly gave the example of vegetables being preserved a lot longer in the refrigerator, but I see that maybe has caught on.
Yeah.
a similar point is if you imagine someone, we'll call him at rest, and he has all sorts of people passing him by at so-called relativistic speeds. I would call them high velocity or high absolute velocity speeds. Then you have within a small space time going at 6 or 7 different rates. And that seems to be counter to the normal concept of time being a single thing that goes at a single rate during, throughout the entire universe. So there seems to be some logic problems with the concept of time and time dilation due to velocity, even before you get to the empirical data. And the problem is, as Roger has pointed out, in some cases, the alleged empirical data for time dilation was just misconstruing the data. But as Franklin notes, in GPS, there's clear data that atomic clocks experience clock retardation. Those clocks go slower, pretty much at the using the Lorentz factor as a slowing factor. But it's not due to relative velocity. It's due to absolute velocity with respect to one and only one frame, namely the GCI frame. So as Ron Hatch, 30 plus patents in the GPS system and the acknowledged expert on the GPS data said, the clock retardation data does not confirm special relativity. You'd only think that if you claim that GCI was the single preferred frame. And if you look at any other inertial frame and look at the data from their point of view, it'd be wildly inaccurate. So one final point that I think is crucial to understanding this area, as Franklin brought up, Lorentz came up with clock retardation, which looked like Einstein's time dilation factor, and the Lorentz transformations, which at least Einstein kept the name when he messed them up. But basically what Einstein did was take Lorentz's preferred frame theory, where the preferred frame was the ether rest frame, and made it so that each and every observer thinks that he's in the single preferred frame. Because they use the Lorentz transformation as though they and only they are in the preferred frame. So when you're talking about Lorentz transformations, you have to be careful. You have Lorentz's original transformations, which were based on a single preferred frame. And then Einstein distorted them and said that anybody in an inertial frame can use physics as though he's in the single preferred frame. So that's obviously contradictory, because you have an infinite number of different observers, all assuming that they are in the single preferred frame, and they said that all of their different views are accurate physics, which removes any possibility of your saying what the causes and effects are, because they all would come up with different causes and effects.
Nick, that makes sense for the first time in my life. What is the difference between Einstein and Lorentz? It's like, you just pretend that you are the fixed ether frame. Except you start looking at assuming that there's two people with their own fixed ether frame. That you get a conflict. That's why the paradox occurs. So
one more point about the word stationary, because in the 1905 presentation or a paper of Einstein's, it was an observer-centric theory. So the stationary frame means the frame that is stationary to observer A, and observer B's frame is the frame that's stationary to observer B. So it's really the observer's frame is what's meant by the stationary frame. And that's how it's used consistently through that 1905 paper and today, actually. So be very careful. I have to admonish Stefan all the time about this. When you talk about Lorentz transformations, you got to differentiate between the special relativity versions of Lorentz transformations and Lorentz's original transformations. Lorentz's original transformations were single preferred frame oriented, and there was one and only one physical theory, namely with the ether frame being the base frame and velocity being absolute velocity with respect to that single frame. And the Einstein version is velocity with respect to every single inertial frame. So every single inertial frame is pretending to be the single preferred frame. And the Lorentz and the Einstein's Lorentz transformations have that flaw. So the math looks the same, but the two theories are at the opposite end of the spectrum. So, by the way, to the degree that Stefan brings anything to the table, it's already been done by Lorentz. Quite simply, straightforwardly, and have that historical background.
So anyone want to take this question? So
well, can I say about that? The problem is that Einstein didn't explain things like that. If you read in the paper and Nick is trying to clarify what is meant, that clarification is not really in Einstein's paper. And what I focused on was saying that Einstein in that paper 1905 says the ether is superfluous. And so with the way I would like to think of it is what he should have done was say, here is the maths with the ether and here is the maths without the ether. And they say, well, the maths without the ether is the correct maths and the maths with the ether is wrong. And he should have shown that. He should have gone through shown the maths for that, and that would have clarified what he meant by ether. But he didn't do that. All you've got him saying the ether is superfluous in that paper. And so you've got ambiguity just from that. What does he mean by ether is superfluous? You don't have the answer. And then he states the things like the relativity principle, and then he's going to start dealing with the Lorentz transformations and that. And he's not showing you how would you handle the Lorentz transformations with the relativity principle versus how you would handle it without the relativity principle. So he's just not explaining himself properly. He's just leaving lots of ambiguities in his paper. It's just not really a proper paper to explain what his thoughts are. And unfortunately, when you go to his other papers, which come later, he's still not presenting a definitive theory. He's still leaving things ambiguous. He's assuming the reader will understand what he means, but he doesn't explicitly state what he means. And then it leads to, well, what he really means is such a thing, and somebody else comes along later and says, no, he means something else. It's just not a proper theory. It's not like Newton's theory, where Newton writes the Principia, he defines his terms, and then divides his maths and so forth. But it's just not. It's with Einstein, where he wants to do things different to Newton. He doesn't explicitly say this is what Newton does, but I'm going to do something different. He doesn't do any of that. It just leaves everything in a total mess. And this is where you get all the faulty logic coming from.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I made an honest effort to get a copy of the 1905 paper, and like read through it. And then, first I'm surprised that the paper is about magnets and wires, about Maxwellian equations, and the
Hmm.
whole thing about if you have a stationary magnet and a moving wire versus a stationary wire and a moving magnet. And so somehow this whole paper is about that and not about clock dilation, not about mass increase, not about E equals mc squares. It has something to do with
Let's add on paper for E equals MC squared.
Faraday equation about,
Yeah.
but now somehow, and then he goes off on this simultaneity thing, which I don't know. Since you're here, Nick, maybe you can enlighten me. But that was the first point of what the is he talking about? He says something about you synchronize the clocks by sending light signals between them. It's like, and that in order for them to be synchronized, the time from clock A to clock B has to be the same as from clock B to clock A. But then he recognizes that if the clocks are moving, that it will take longer. That may not happen. But yet somehow he's using this to synchronize the clocks. And I'm going, what the heck kind of way is that to synchronize?
Yeah,
Well, I agree, but that's another case of what he's doing is having each inertial observer act as though he's in the single preferred frame, because that would be correct in the single preferred frame. In his example, if you were in the ether frame, that's the way it would work, because the speed of light is the same in all directions. But it's totally fallacious to use that and creates a false, an erroneous physical model, if that's how you define simultaneity.
Well, I don't even get how that works. I mean, how would you even know, the time of flight time from clock A to clock B? I mean, you'd have to use another clock. Now,
But
really,
in the ether frame, that's a good way to synchronize everything. In fact, that's probably the only easy way to synchronize things.
no, I don't think it would work at all on a practical basis. It's like
If you're at rest in the ether, all the clocks are at rest in the ether frame.
I think the only way to make the clock synchronize is put them all in one place. Whenever the thieves are going to, attack the safe, they say synchronize watches. Okay, so everybody put the watch in the same place, and then they go to different places, and those watches are synchronized. That's how you synchronize watches. You don't.
The problem with that is that if you got all the clocks in one place, then you synchronize them. It's supposed to be that when you start moving the clocks around, they're not. You got problems in synchronizing them still. They're not necessarily going to stick to the same time intervals.
But
that's the problem.
Well, that would be presuming that relative effects actually even
Yeah,
happen, right?
You're assuming the clocks are not all going to be keeping the same rates when you start moving them around.
I have to think about it some more, but
Yeah.
I see how sending signals between clocks is at all a useful procedure for synchronizing.
That's called Einstein synchronization.
Yes, and
the way he synchronizes clocks.
That's the first thing I looked at that didn't make it.
Yeah.
Law.
So it seems to be central to Einstein's relativity. You've got to synchronize the clocks in the way he says. If you don't synchronize the clocks his way, then you've got something else going on.
Well, to me, I kind of suspected the reason why you get all these weird relativity effects is because of this synchronization procedure.
Yeah.
And that, you're going to say that these two clocks are synchronized by this procedure, but, if you put them back together again, you see, no, they're not synchronized. They're not.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah, that's what's going on. That it seems to be
synchronized.
Seems to be circular with Einstein. You've got to do things his way, and then it leads you back to what he claims. So it's circular.
It just makes no
sense. You got to synchronize his clocks in his way to get what he says.
That's right.
But if you do things a different way, then you could get something else.
Right.
So if you do an experiment and you're not getting the same results as what Einstein says, then one of the assumptions the main thing you're going to do is you've done the experiment wrong. And by that they mean you haven't done the experiment in the way that Einstein wants you to do the experiment.
Yeah, by
Well, let me just repeat again. Einstein set it up. His equations, like length contraction and time dilation, are set up to have the observer simulate being in the as though he's in the single preferred frame. And in the single preferred frame, that would be the way that you synchronize all the clocks in your frame. So for things to work in Einstein's special relativity, you have to follow that model consistently. You have to synchronize your clock as though you're at rest in the single, you assume that you're at rest in the single preferred frame, even though that gives erroneous results.
Yeah. It's like that.
Question here: how about the one-way speed of light? So what about the one-ways? I heard that.
yeah.
Says it's impossible to do.
In the if you go back to Einstein's 1905 paper again, he doesn't say anything about one-way speed of light or two-way speed of light. It's sort of like another interpretation being labelled on top of it. It's all right if you got light going just in one direction from one clock to another clock, that'd be one way light speed. But if you got light going from a clock, hits a mirror, and then comes back to the clock again, that's two-way light speed. So you're just using one clock. So you've got a difference between what would you get if you're using two clocks versus if you were just using one clock. So you got one-way light speed and two-way light speed. And if you kind of like look to Einstein to explain what's going on there, you can end up into another mess of confusion. Is Einstein when he's talking about light speed being constant, is he talking about the one-way light speed being constant or the two-way light speed being constant, or is he referring to both of them being constant? But that's another add-on to what he was saying in his 1905 paper. And so you kind of like trying to reinterpret what he's saying again in the context of different concepts.
Yeah, we got some other people questioning about what's the one-way speed of light.
Owls, one-way speed of light, they do OWLS, one-way light speed. But it's massive argument again. That's a massive argument with what is that supposed to mean. If you look for Einstein, you're not going to get much clarification.
Because Stephen Giff's favorite experiment is to note that the speed of light is faster going from west to east than from east to west. That's his favorite experiment. That the two-way speed of light is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
I don't think Einstein said any of that. So they've done an experiment where they found that, and they're still interpreting that to mean that Einstein is right. But how do they get that again from what Einstein's saying? I don't know. There seems to be a break in the logic again, faulty logic. How do you get from what he says to what they're claiming from the experiment and still saying that he's right?
Is that if you establish a fixed frame, the ECI, that's the fixed inertial frame. Now, people don't know that the GPS works on the assumption that there is at a point at the center of the Earth. Okay, you affix a frame as if you just fill all of space with a solid block of steel, that it is affixed to that point. So that is the preferred frame. And then if you assume that, then you will find out that yes, the speed of light, well, the amount of time it takes can go from Los Angeles to New York, and the time it goes from New York to back to Los Angeles is going to be different because New York is flying away versus LA, which is coming closer. And anytime you send a signal, right?
Yeah, and Lorentz theory would say the same thing as long as it was accepted that the GCI frame was the fixed frame.
But in fact, the Lorentz transformation formula, that's how you calculate it. but somehow, since that's associated with the 1905 paper, which is plagiarizing Lorentz transformations, they said, "Oh, that's experimentally proven."
Right. The
Yeah.
thing is, in Einstein's messed up version of the Lorentz transformations, the velocity is velocity with respect to any inertial frame. If you're an observer, you plug in velocity with respect to your frame. Whereas in Lorentz's original transformation, the physical meaning of the Lorentz transformation was entirely different. It's velocity, you'd plug in velocity with respect to the ether rest frame, or this, to make it more general, the single preferred frame. And the inverse is entirely different, even mathematically, than Einstein's mirror image transformation. The mirror image in Lorentz's transformation is the true physical inverse. In other words, rather than dividing by the Lorentz factor, you'd multiply by the Lorentz factor going from, and the Lorentz inverse transformation only works going from a non-preferred frame back to a preferred frame, back to the single preferred frame.
So, for example, an Einstein proponent would say that, if you're in New York, you use that as your frame of reference, and if you're in LA, you use that as your frame of reference, and they would predict that the signals passing between the two cities should always be the same, because that's how you calculate it. If you presume that you're the center of the universe and you're the center of the universe, then of course the calculations are going to be, but experimentally they're not. Right?
Yeah,
right.
You're assuming you're assuming what you're working from is an inertial frame, when actually the Earth moves and spins on its axis and moves around the sun and so forth. So when you do an experiment and it doesn't quite agree with your assumption that you're in an inertial frame, then you're kind of like chopping that off as experimental error, and that's another area of complaining with what the mainstream is doing. It's never clear from the experiments, what are they doing, what are they dismissing as experimental error.
Right, just one other minor point. In GPS, they're not assuming that the GCI frame is the universal frame. It's just within the vicinity of the Earth, the ECI frame is the single preferred frame. And they kind of assume that if you're on Jupiter, it would be the GCI frame that would be the single preferred frame.
Yeah, you think, not unless you're a geocentrist and believe in the axis of evil, that the Earth is infinite.
Yeah, I'm not geocentric.
But the geocentrists would definitely point to that as evidence that we are in fact the center of the universe. And
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's the other way. That's the only other way you could think about it. The only way to disprove that would be to go send a bunch of GPS clocks around the moon or Jupiter and show that it's different.
Yeah.
Or we could send those out and find out the GPS can't be done on, say, the moon, because only the Earth can be considered the.
Well, Ron Hatch was also very familiar with the NASA data, and the NASA scientists were assuming they were using special relativity, and they were using the barycentric, the solar barycentric frame as the frame for the single preferred frame for interplanetary travel calculations. And when Ron pointed out that really wasn't relativity, they were using a single preferred frame, and if they used any other frame, they'd get errors, but they still weren't convinced that they weren't using the special relativity. They saw the equation could give out the right answer, and that convinced them that they were using special relativity.
With a lot of it, that the physicists, if they do an experiment and it fits their equations, then they just assume that's relativity.
Yes.
So it's another assumption on their part that they don't really critically look at relativity as to whether it's really showing what they're doing with their maths.
Right.
So do you guys want to take a look at this comment here about speed of light not being constant throughout the solar system?
Well,
You see, my comment about this is that this is a misnomer about how relativity is interpreted, and that people say that the speed of light is constant. Obviously, the speed of light is not constant. The speed of light goes different speeds. You put it through water, it's a different speed. It goes a different speed through every single kind of material. So in no way is the speed of light a constant, not even in a vacuum, because we have gravitational effects, and the speed of light is not constant even in a pure vacuum. So it's not really, can't be said to be a constant, but it's kind of the same if the environment is the same kind of thing, right?
Right.
It seems to be an idealization to think you've got light in a perfect vacuum, and without any fields working upon it, and then they're going to call that constant. It is an idealization.
Well, my point is it goes worse than that, because it's not constant in the sense that it is only represented by a single number, 299 or whatever meters per second. It's definitely not constant. So it's like the speed of light obviously is not constant. My reaction to this is like, the speed of light obviously is not constant. And it's only constant in the same, I think, only constant in the sense that that the speed of sound is constant relative to the frame of the atmosphere, right? And then you can say that wherever or however the emitter of the sound is, it doesn't matter whether it's moving or not. The speed of that sound will travel at a certain definite constant speed. That is what is actually truly constant, right? The 1905 specifically says that it's constant and not dependent upon the motion of the sender or receiver. Now that's a completely different kind of constant, right? That if you have a car and a train and they're heading down the same path and they both beep their horn at exactly the same time, what is constant is that sound will travel from both vehicles at the same speed. That is what is constant, meaning it is not dependent upon the motion of the transmitter, right? So I just wanted to make that point. That's what's that not dependent upon the motion of the transmitter. Not that the wave itself is somehow constant. I guess it is, but the difference is that it doesn't not depend upon the motion of transmitter. So.
Right, and people often write the speed of light is constant c, and then in parentheses in a vacuum, which was probably reasonably correct back in 1905. But as Franklin points out, it also depends on if that vacuum is in a high potential gravitational area or a low potential gravitational area.
And vacuum doesn't really exist anymore because of quantum physics.
Right.
You've got virtual particles popping into out of existence, even if you've got a perfect vacuum.
Yeah, but you're still not getting my main point, which is that the constant does not refer to the actual velocity of the light.
But is it split though with
respect to the transmitting velocity? Whatever is moving, no matter how they're moving, the speed of light remains constant regardless of the motion of the transmitter. That is what is constant, not that. I mean, once again, it's kind of hard to think about because it's like, it's constant, but constant with regard to the motion of the transmitter. Because if this doesn't work with, say, bullets and guns, right? Because if the speed of a bullet is not constant with respect to the motion of the gun, because if the gun is moving faster in the direction of motion, the bullet will end up being faster. So its speed is not constant with respect to the motion of the gun. It carries the motion of the gun versus sound or light, where you have a speaker, it could be moving very fast, but the wavefront will be moving at the same speed as something that did at the same time, which is slower.
Well, one other point from Ron Hatch and GPS is that the speed of light relative to the receiver is dependent on the receiver's velocity, which is contrary to how special relativity is normally taught and believed in academia.
Yeah, that kind of depends on how you're measuring, I guess, as the receiver. I mean, this is why it's hard to think about, because the only way I can think about it, I think Einstein did have this light sphere concept or something like that.
Yeah.
That you would see that if you just like turned on a light bulb somewhere, and you would see its sphere of influence grow. And one way of saying that the light is traveling at the same speed is to look at how that thing expands, and no matter what speed that emitter was traveling at, you would see it expand in both directions the same way, kind of thing. But it's a real,
and if you've got Lorentz contraction, then that sphere is distorted.
Yeah, then you have the things like it appears to be smaller. I mean, that's where these length contraction things come from, right? I mean, did it actually get smaller? If I put my finger in front of your picture and squish it, am I actually making your head smaller? No, it's a perspective thing.
So if I go back decades when they first hit me with Einstein's relativity, it's sort of, you've got an object and you got length contraction in the direction it's moving in. And so that means its density is increasing. Yeah.
Right.
So the volume is shrinking for the object with its length contraction. So the density of the object is that increasing. And they didn't really go into explaining what's supposed to happen then with the density increases. Because I thought, well, you got an object, the object's supposed to flatten into sort of like being a disk eventually. If it's a sphere, then it's moving along, and then it's flattening in the direction it's moving in, and it ends up being like a disk. But then, well, there's the maths of the distribution, but surely the maths of the object is then going to have a sort of like gravitational effect and pull some of it down from the other direction, so it's going to shrink the other directions as well. Mm-hmm. It's just as well as the direction it's moving in, but then you're supposed to be ignoring the effect of gravity from its mass. It just doesn't. It starts breaking down. It doesn't. You can't just suddenly stick. Well, there's no gravity and stay with that. It's suddenly. Well, eventually, there's going to be a gravity effect coming along on top of everything else.
Well, another way to look at that type of example is, as you were saying, the volume would decrease and the density would increase.
Yes.
But there is some observer somewhere that would observe it such that, so as to predict that object would become a black hole because it would exceed the density, but it doesn't become a black hole. So that goes against Einstein saying that all observers using special relativity have equally valid views of what's happening physically.
Yeah. Also, I remember now, one of the things I used to argue with people, the flat Earth versus the spherical Earth. Well, if an observer is going by the Earth really fast, then he's supposed to see it flattened into a disk. Then it is a flat Earth. If God is a relativistic observer, and he's going to say, God's going to say that planet's flat. That's a flat Earth. And then God writes the Bible, flat Earth. And I used to get into a lot of nonsense arguments about that.
Yeah.
Einstein proves the Earth is flat, according to God.
All we have to be doing is just flying at the speed of light, and in fact,
Yeah. It's a flat Earth.
and we would not notice. It would be round,
Yeah.
but we are in fact. That's flat.
We're not flat. From God's point of view, we got flat Earth, but from a person on the Earth, it's spherical.
So we just been misunderstanding it the entire time. Okay.
So whole understanding the Bible's been messed up as well.
Now we do have a couple other people in the green room, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Check to see. I'm going to temporarily stick them up here. We've got Dennis and James and also Harry. So, you guys have any comments about this? I'm particularly interested about this revelation that Nick has made that relativity is just Lorentz theory, but you just bias your particular frame as being the preferred fixed frame. That's brilliant. Dennis or James, do you have any comments about that?
Well, it's talking about one-way velocity of light. It was Romer, Ole Romer, when this was known to Newton and really influenced Newton.
I think you're making some wrong assumptions in this discussion.
Yeah, well, what wrong assumptions are we? I'm sure we are.
If I can continue, the astronomer Romer looked at Jupiter, the moons of Jupiter, and the astronomers know just when those moons are going to go into eclipse.
Am I turned on here? You listening to me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Harry.
Yeah.
Harry, I think you have a delay.
Well, Dennis is trying to talk and Harry is trying to talk at the same time.
Well, let's let Dennis go first, and then Harry, you can talk after that. How about that?
Okay, Dennis.
Yeah, Ole Romer was an early astronomer, and he watched the moons of Jupiter, which are predictable. Their orbit is predictable, and they know it's known just exactly when they'll go into eclipse, and at what time, and so on. Just like it's known when there'll be eclipses of the sun, eclipses of the moon. And he found out that depending on which direction the light was coming from the moons of Jupiter to Earth, the time was shifted based on, he assumed based on the fact that, as Franklin mentioned, if you fire a gun, the velocity of sound only depends on the velocity of the air. It doesn't depend on the velocity of the gun. And so he found out, and then Bradley later on confirmed this, he found out that when the direction between the Earth and Jupiter was in a certain...
Alexa, turn off the TV.
Power supply.
Alexa, turn off the
TV. So anyway, to make a long story short, the one-way velocity of light was measured in this way, because depending on which, if the lines from Jupiter to the Earth at a certain time, depending on how that was with regard to where the Jupiter and Earth were at that time, gave a way to measure the one-way velocity of light.
Good point.
Okay, let's see if we can get Harry in here. So Harry, we see you. You can go ahead and make your comments now if you can hear us. Are you there, Harry? You might be experiencing the delay or something. Yeah, we seem to have some kind of technical problem with Harry there. But you can go ahead and oh, we seem to have lost him. Okay.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, that's what we have. We have technical difficulties.
I think he's probably had what I've got, a problem where you get a time delay. That's what I was having last week with my computer desktop. And this laptop
problem. Is that what?
This laptop seems to be working better, but it's too small for me now on the screen. I used to have a big screen. It's never perfect. I think with the older computers, the memory gets overloaded and so forth, and then it just puts a time delay on it.
Does it? See, look, we have some fans.
Yeah.
Anti-Einstein dream.
Maybe Harry come back.
How about James? James.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Nick and Dennis
Hi.
and Franklin and Roger.
Hi.
I guess
Hi.
the comment that I would like to make with regard to this anti-Einstein dream team, that was the last comment displayed at the bottom of the screen from a viewer, is maybe it would be great if some of the great minds here would attack the assumption of continuous space-time on which all of this other theories are based, including Newton and the general relativity, special relativity, classical mechanics, and so forth, and even the standard model. So wouldn't it be great if we could debunk the theory that space and time are continuous and actually are quantized? So that's that would be a new goal, a new thing to debunk, because it seems like debunking Einstein is getting a little old, and maybe you might even say a little boring.
Yeah, but that's a long topic unto itself, I think, James.
Well, we've got all these great minds here. Let's debunk that assumption. And start to think of data and experiments which show that assumption is false, and that in fact space is quantized, as my work claims, time and also energy. Let's go ahead and debunk this theory, because once that theory goes, all the others go with it by definition. And so,
well, how do you
like
think
the
that
Newtonian idea that angular and linear momentum are conserved has been questioned seriously by the inertial propulsion stuff. Dennis is well aware of this. And in fact, Dennis pointed this out to me. And so, like maybe we should start to debunk some other things, like let's debunk the mother one. You see, because simply
James is
Hi. I think we're having problems because there's too many people here now. Sort of like they think things not able to process things properly. Can you hear me?
Usually that's because there's problems with the transmission end.
Yeah.
But
So
try and remove. Let's just try to remove a few people here.
when Harry came back, it's sort of like James started to break up.
Yeah, we haven't heard from Harry. Take me down and let's listen to Harry.
Okay. Go on, Harry.
I agree. I think that what happened when you have more than one person in the conversation, the delay processing gets flaky. That's my observation. Okay. My comment is I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. If you can hear me, if you don't hear me, let me know. There's a big delay.
We got you. You're okay.
I think the big point of what John Chappell was trying to say is the philosophy that's at the basis of special relativity is faulty. The philosophy behind it. I think that's what he was saying, and nobody really addressed that issue. And I think what he was also saying was that was compounded by the mistakes in the philosophy of science that's currently being used and the political control that is being exercised by the mainstream establishment. That was my take on three things that he said, although he said a lot more than just those three things. But I think that would be what my take was. Now, my view is the essential problem with relativity is, as you pointed out, that it's vague and undefined. That's certainly true. But this principle of relativity is a philosophical principle. Okay, it's a philosophy. It's philosophy. It's not science. It's metaphysics. It's metaphysical philosophy. The laws of physics are the same in every inertial frame. And then he extends that in general relativity to a more generalized. That principle of relativity is what leads to all the problems. And Nick has pointed out the problems very clearly, in that the Lorentz theory gets multiplied by all these different inertial frames. So it's the principle of relativity that causes all these problems with inertial observers and contradictions and paradoxes. Jettisoning that solves a lot of problems. And when you jettison that, you're kind of you're sort of back to the Lorentz theory, which only has one frame of reference. Okay. But the Lorentz theory has the ether, and so people don't want to say that. Well, we can make a Lorentz theory without an ether, and then we'll be fine, I think. Now, as to the discussion about the speed of light being a constant, which is his other postulate, well, it turns out that the derivation of the Lorentz transform, in order to derive the Lorentz transform, you make the assumption that the speed of light is a constant. Okay, moving relative to the one preferred frame. So the speed of light is a constant is an assumption that leads into the invariance of the Maxwell equations. And that's essentially a fundamental that goes back to the Lorentz theory. See, that's what Lorentz and actually Voigt, even before that, when he first derived what appears to be the Lorentz transform, but it differs by a multiplicative constant. So Voigt, so this Lorentz transform had been derived by Voigt originally, or you could say it looked like the Lorentz transform, although it was different by a constant. And then Lorentz developed this idea of local time, and he was kind of struggling with the idea of making Maxwell's equations invariant. Okay, and that's kind of where the Lorentz transform started to originate. Einstein sort of basically, the reason he was successful was because he was able to derive it exactly. Okay, but his assumptions that he used to derive it exactly don't look to be the principle of relativity just fouls everything up. Okay, that's a philosophical assumption that just makes a mess out of the theory. And then when Minkowski came along, and you get all the space-time theory of Minkowski space-time, it makes it even look worse, and the mathematics is just horrendous. So I think what John Chappell is objecting to is the philosophy behind it, the idea about what time is. Time's not defined in Einstein's theory at all. And so it's a vague, it's not defined. So what is it? Then you have a problem with the scientific method, which they do an experiment and they think they're proving Einstein's theory, but to prove Einstein's theory, you have to prove that the principle of relativity is correct. And no experiment has ever done that.
Well, they when they do the experiments, they don't. I don't think they don't usually test the whole complete thing of the theory, and they just test parts of the theory. So when they're testing the Lorentz transformations, they then think they've proven the whole thing of Einstein's relativity, and they don't really look into the other issues of what Lorentz says about using them versus what Einstein says about using them. So they're doing it incomplete, looking at the experiments. They're doing it sort of like piecemeal. This experiment shows such thing. This experiment shows something else, and so forth.
I'd like to comment a little bit on the Solari theory, if I might.
Yeah, all of this is sort of, a lot of this is going beyond what John Chappell was talking about. Really wanted to stay with what he was saying, and sort of like you had James' suggestion, we should move on from criticizing Einstein's relativity and lots of other diversions onto extra topics, like what is CERN showing, which is not really what John Chappell was dealing with. So it's all moving on further and further, all the way from what
with
John
regard to Stephen Giff's the Solari theory. The Solari theory basically makes an assumption about clock retardation. He calls it weak relativity. But his solutions, the transforms that you get in the Solari theory, are the same transforms that Einstein got in 1905 and 1907. So it's just basically the same theory, basically presented differently. It's Einstein's theory presented differently. That's all it is. It's got some different mathematical equations and to make it look different. And it doesn't have the strong relativity principle, which is that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames. A strong relativity principle. He takes a weak relativity principle, whatever he means by that, which eliminates the clock paradox and the twin paradoxes and the other paradoxes that you get because of the principle of relativity. And that's really where all the paradoxes come from, is the principle of relativity. So getting rid of that principle of relativity is really basically the key to solving this problem.
Well,
and if we get rid of that, then we don't have a problem with, as Jim Kane says, we can look at other issues. We can't get rid of this principle of relativity because it's philosophy.
When Einstein states his postulates in 1905, from my perspective, he's stating this relativity principle, and he's not always going to use it. He's doing his derivations on things, and he's not actually going to use it. He's kind of like piecemeal when it's not really there all the time. I mean, it's sort of, if he wrote a paper properly, he would have had to address the issue of symmetric clock retardation versus asymmetric clock retardation, and explain why he thinks and what clocks record is the same as time.
He doesn't do that, which is the beauty of his theory, which is he doesn't actually. He makes the assumption in his 1907 paper that the equations are therefore symmetric, but he doesn't look at any of the implications that symmetry principle creates. So he never tested his theory to see if it was logically correct. And the problem is that there has never been any experiment that would to assess the principle of relativity as being correct. Okay. And even though the theory produces paradoxes and absurd predictions, and these are well known, they just basically ignore that. There's no experimental test of the principle of relativity. And since there's no experimental test of the principle of relativity to verify that, that means it's just a metaphysical assumption. It's just philosophy, and it's not science. And because it causes problems in the mathematics that produce paradoxes and contradictions, it ought to be abandoned. That's basically
There's a problem with what does physics take from metaphysics. If I concentrate on that bit of issue, because at one time they wouldn't just dismiss atoms as metaphysical, and so there's lots of concepts that you get into a metaphysical problem. Should physics accept these metaphysical concepts or not? So this is part what I think is problem is the philosophy again, that you go back to the philosophy issue, which physics is based upon. Then there's a lot of argument going on. I don't see how you can dismiss all metaphysical concepts. And if you can accept some metaphysical concepts, then why accept them and not other ones?
So the principle of relativity causes havoc. That's all of the confusion that Franklin Hugh talked about, and all of the confusion that surrounds the point that John Chappell was getting at, and all of the issues that he was trying to raise and to get at, they all arise from the principle of relativity, which is an unproven metaphysical or philosophical hypothesis that he attached to the Lorentz theory. Okay. He attached this principle of relativity to the Lorentz theory. Okay. And made it look like that this principle was this great, wonderful solution to this difficulty of the Michelson-Morley experiment. And then he said, well, you know, this principle of relativity is great and wonderful, and it solves all these problems, but it didn't really solve all the problems. It just created a bunch of other problems.
Yeah.
And we're talking about all these other problems. I mean, Franklin Hugh just goes round and round and round, talked about all these, oh, it's confusing, blah, blah, blah. And you listen to him and you go, well, this is all really confusing. None of this makes sense. Get to the point of where the problem is. The problem's in this principle of relativity. It's not been proved in any experiment, and it arises from just philosophy. It's just a metaphysical idea that Einstein had that he thought made sense, and it doesn't.
But it goes back before Einstein, the principle of relativity. I think the first person to mention principle of relativity,
I'm talking about Einstein's version of it, which
I know there are other versions of the principle of relativity, and so you got Poincaré talking about the principle of relativity, and that was before Einstein. And then if you go back, it seems to be a foundational thing with Copernican revolution, that you've got this relativity idea. So it's sort of like, well, we can
work in the special theory of relativity.
Yeah, well, you can disagree with what Einstein's saying about, but it has a long physics tradition from the Copernican revolution. So it's difficult to discard the idea completely.
What he did was he took this Newtonian idea, the Galilean idea, and he attached it to Lorentz's theory. Okay, that's the point. He attached it to Lorentz's theory so that it would apply to electrodynamics.
Yeah.
Okay, and it just doesn't work. That's the bottom line. It just doesn't work. It causes too many problems. It causes too much confusion. You got too many people saying, I don't believe in this principle of this theory of relativity. It doesn't make any sense. It's vague. It's confusing. It's illogical. All this stuff, all of this points that what John Chappell was trying to make are all basically arise from Einstein's attempt to attach this strong principle of relativity to the Lorentz theory. And when he did that, it just created all these problems. And then Minkowski came along with the space-time, all this stuff. And basically what you have now is a lot of people who just can't accept all of the metaphysical confusion and vagueness that gets associated with this theory that is essentially the principle of relativity tagged on to Lorentz's theory.
But Harry, I wanted to ask you about the connection to, say, the Maxwell-Faraday, because I still don't see what the connection is between the whole magnet wire thing. And when you read that section of the paper, it just gets super mathematical. It's like shows us.
Einstein's trying to claim that that's an example of his principle of relativity applied to electrodynamics. So he's saying that's an example of my principle of relativity. That's what he's trying to say. And then he's trying to use that as a way to tag on his principle of relativity to electrodynamics. Okay. He wants to apply the principle of relativity to electrodynamics and say he's got this wonderful new theory. He solved all the problems. Okay. Now the problem is, the difficulty is that what John Chappell was trying to point out is that this causes illogical problems, philosophical problems. It causes lots and lots of problems. People just don't like it. They don't find it to be convincing in many, many different ways. And the science establishment is completely wedded to this theory now because they think experiments prove it, but no experiment proves the principle of relativity.
No, they won't. The physics establishment won't accept that, though. So you've got this total disconnect between everything.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're getting close to the end of time. So
Okay.
Roger, I'll let you summarize if you'd like.
Yeah. The summary is that John Chappell pointed out a lot of the problems with Einstein's relativity, and the mainstream doesn't really want to go into a debate with us people who don't agree with Einstein's relativity. They're just going to block it, and you can point out the problems. They just don't want to enlighten us as to what are supposed to be the answers to these problems. So they're just leaving all these problems, which are really paradoxes and seemingly contradictions in what they're talking about, and they seem to be happy with just doing that, which is, well, from my point of view, not doing proper science. But that's the way, unfortunately, the mainstream are like. They just carry on regardless, ignoring the problems, and not wanting to go into a sensible debate with people who are pointing out the problems. Yeah, John Chappell pointed out, decades later, we still got this same situation. Thank you. Let's go finish it now. Finish the talk. Close. End stream. Goodbye. Thank you, everybody. Next time, I'm hoping to do a part 2, and there is a wealth of information on the internet about people complaining about Einstein's relativity. So we'll see where we go from there. Thank you. Bye. End session. Yeah.